PlexTrac is the premier pen test reporting and collaboration platform, empowering your team to spend more time hacking and less time reporting. PlexTrac centralizes your data, streamlines tedious workflows, automates report building, and facilitates communication with stakeholders. To learn how you can achieve a 30% increase in efficiency and cut report cycles by up to 65%, head to securityweekly.com/PlexTrac. Claim your free month of PlexTrac and get your copy of the Writing a Killer Penetration Test Report Guide today. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe and subscribe to any of our podcasts and have all new episodes downloaded right to your device. You can join our mailing list Discord server and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. On to the news for this week. I guess we should start by talking about VMware. Roll the dice and roll VMware, because that seemed to be the hot topic. This was like a 2021 vulnerability. Is that true?
Yes, it was. The fix was released in 21, but that doesn't mean people actually deployed it.
Yeah. I feel like upgrading VMware is right up there on the priority list with updating firmware.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's your hypervisor, as we discussed with Hal, right? It's that lower layer. And people didn't apply the patch, and now they're getting ransomware. Imagine that.
Dope.
That's about as much as I read about this story, because I tend not to focus on the ones that are really popular. I don't know why.
So, what I find interesting about this story is they talk about, the issues with VMware 6.7, 6.5, and 7.0, but I don't see a lot of coverage on, hey, how about upgrading to 8.0? Because that's out. Kind of.
But I think
I wound up having to do that for a different reason.
Yeah, but I feel like this is technical debt, like where I am with some of my firewalls, is it's something that's pretty critical, right?
Yeah.
Like firewall in this context, all our stuff streams out over the internet and stuff. So it's not really a great time to do upgrades. VMware is kind of the same thing. But the longer you wait, the more arduous that task becomes because of technical debt. And so we've all been there. I'm guarantee we've all been there when you're like, oh, now I got to go from 2.4 to 2.5, and then from 2.5 to 2.6 and 2.6 to 2.7. And in each one of those steps, there's a list of, like, this crap could go wrong, and here's how to fix that crap in case it goes wrong. And then before you go to the next step, here's the stuff you need to do before you go to the next step after you fix all the crap that went wrong. So it takes what would have been probably a pretty minor update now a really long time, if it even completes, before you're like, oh, just blow it away and start over. So now you've just incurred more technical debt. I've been there with Linux, man. It's one of the reasons why I went to a rolling release, right? I was just constantly, it's my philosophy, right? Constantly get new updates, fix the new stuff as it comes up. Yes, it's disruptive at that moment, but you're fixing it in smaller chunks, right? I do the same thing with containers and development. Upgrade the library, see what breaks. Because right now it's one library that needs to go from like 2.0 to 2.1, and all I got to change is one little thing, and we're off to the races. You wait, and you're on VMware 6.5, and you go to 8. I'm sure that's not fun.
No, well, actually, I wound up with a lot of those concerns. The reason I went from 6.7 to 8 was because my NUC that I was running everything on crapped out, and I got a new one, but none of the versions supported the Ethernet NIC, and there was a lot of instructions on rolling a new version of that installer. And then I tried 8, it actually just knew it out of the box. It was like, okay. But it took what I was hoping for to be 20 minutes to, half a day, because, IT.
Well, did you have to, upgrade all your VMs to work with that version?
Well, actually, I was able to import them, and then it didn't force me to do an update, the compatibility update.
Yeah.
So I was good there. I got my primary VM that I cared about working, and then I And then later I made sure that the SLP service was off when I was looking at the vulnerability stuff, and it actually was off by default in version 8, which is cool. So yeah. But I'm wondering if that that VM somehow tags as being well, I'm sure it tags as VMware. That's why I'm getting all these probes over the internet that my router's stopping.
Yeah, people are definitely looking for it.
The Amazon streaming does not like it when your router blocks a DDoS attack. It stops playing.
Yep. That'll happen. We talked about the OpenSSH vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-auth double free. Hal was talking about it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, though, my theory is that the proactive measures put in place by modern memory allocators, the article says, and robust privilege separation and sandboxing on the impacted SSHD processes, the protections that Hal was talking about. I wonder how much of that exists on embedded systems, IoT devices, appliances, and OT systems that run OpenSSH, but either run older versions or have squished it down to run on some of these more isolated platforms, if they benefit from the same protections, if this vulnerability is more exploitable on those platforms. I don't know the answer. Just a theory.
So one of my questions on this one was, what distributions have got 9.1 on them or 9 already? I mean, your Red Hat is not that far ahead.
Well, and typically what they'll do is they'll backport the patch. But that opens up a whole, I mean, I think we've talked about it on the show, certainly over the years, right? That opens up a whole other can of worms and potential issues. Yeah, I'm 9.1P1 on my Manjaro system.
Right.
Well, because that's a roll. Again, why I like being on the rolling release.
I mean, not the latest version of Debian, but the one that's replacing the latest version. I've forgotten the names for it. It's like 11.6 is the current one. It's the one after that has the 9.1 release in it.
Yeah, and I'm still like Buster 10 on some of my systems, which is still supported.
Really?
Yeah.
He's still supported.
How old is that?
It's old.
I'm not going to hate on you for the version you're running.
Right. Well, because, you get a device, it stands up, it runs, and provides a service, and then you're like, well, now I just got to go install a new operating system just for the fact that there's a new operating system, when actually I believe that system, all it does is run Samba.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about Debian, after spending a lot of time messing around with the Red Hats and stuff, is Debian you actually can upgrade across major versions without doing a reinstall.
Correct.
Whether you should is another question.
Yeah, I've had mixed results with that for sure.
I was running some appliances where it was pretty much the OS came on the CD was an old version of Debian, so I had to install that. So being able to do the OS update was really nice. I could get up to almost current.
Yeah, I did that on one of my Raspberry Pis. My Raspberry Pis, I did the dist upgrade. I was like, just get it up to something that's supported. Even though it's not like the best, but I'll replace it eventually or rebuild it. Not that you're going out and buying new Raspberry Pis right now.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I have a few spares. Like 12.
So, I was, if we're ready to move on from this one, I was thinking of trolling you with my number 3 story.
Oh, really?
I was going to ask for that one, I think.
Head crab.
That one, and I'm interested in Sam's number 3, too.
Yeah. So, the, head crab is a character out of a game that infects humans and turns them into zombies. So if you read the post from the gang about head crab, they talk about increased zombie behavior. I'm trying to think of some newscaster trying to say head crab in a newscast with a straight face. But what this really is about is it's malware. It's attacking Redis instances with the slave of capability, which basically allows modules and other functionality to be seamlessly replicated, and then it adds the CNC controls through a malicious add-on to Redis.
Yeah.
So like
it's fascinating how this
Redis, for
works.
Christ's
Yeah,
sake,
it's
but
fascinating how this particular one works for sure.
oh, yeah. I mean, I thought it was really cool how it worked, and it's like, damn. Well, it's not the last or first time we've seen trust relationships exploited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
And
think we covered this when it first came out. This particular attack, we covered it
Mm-hmm.
in a little more detail, and it is fascinating, and it's, I think, even more fascinating perhaps that it's still persisting. We're still seeing it. It's still growing.
Yeah.
Which means it comes back to much like VMware, like people aren't keeping their stuff up to date or properly securing. In this case, it was a master slave. I think that comes from their documentation. I know we're not supposed to use those words anymore, but it's been, like Hal said, I was using Unix when I was, I don't know, 7 years old, 8 years old, or whatever it was. And those were the terms we used. So I apologize. There's a lot of, unlearning I have to do. But it was the primary, secondary, I'll use the terms, right, to have those be connected to each other. And they took advantage of that. And in that replication process is what allowed them to gain code execution. But then the post exploitation was like really super interesting too on this one. I don't remember all the details, but it's definitely worth a read.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a read. He has a list. They have a list of all the C2 commands that get implemented with this sharing. And by the way, yeah, you're right on the master slave term, but the configuration is SLAVEOF. So that's why I put it in my comments, because I wanted people to know what configuration setting to look for.
Correct.
Am I reading this correctly? That in the one instance, the attacker's Monero wallet showed an annual expected profit of almost $4,500 per worker, which was higher than the typical $200 per year per worker. Is that because, I mean, it's stating here that it's also being seen running in either in clean hosts or at a leading security company, which made detection and attribution more difficult.
Because it was cryptocurrency mining?
Yeah.
So it's mining at a leading security company. And they're getting paid extremely higher.
Because whenever a security company has like huge servers they're running it on so they can mine it.
Oh, man.
It used to be at universities had those big servers to mine stuff.
And terrible security.
Coupled with terrible, and a lot of bandwidth. That's what made it fun to work at university in security. It's like the perfect storm. You were a big target. Like, why did they target university? I'm like, we got a lot of powerful systems. We got a lot of bandwidth. And poor security.
Very well.
The trifecta.
Yeah.
Well, if we're ready to move on, we can talk about my number 3.
Go for it.
Mentioned. Okay, this is a company called Sansec did an analysis, and they found that 12% of servers make a stupid human mistake. That somebody makes a backup of the data on the publicly available web server and makes it world readable right there. And so there are brute force attacks just trying for common backup names and finding them. So it's ridiculous, but there always seem to be an endless number of stupid ways to expose your data. If it's not SQL injection, it's an open Amazon bucket, and now it's just a backup file lying on the server.
That somehow gets indexed by the web server? Is that the case?
Yeah, they're just putting it on the web server in a directory
that's accessible.
In the HTML directory, apparently, and hoping nobody will find it, which I thought everybody learned long ago that Google will find anything, and there are other crawlers that find anything.
Yeah, I mean, you just brute force guess.
Yeah.
The name. There's Durbuster. Durbuster's the tool.
Durbuster.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, there's this term for that. It's called security through obscurity. It works so well.
I know. I thought everybody knew not to do this, but obviously not.
Oh, crap. If you're on the Discord, they guessed the company, or they know the company that this had happened to on our last story.
Oh, I see it.
I'm not going to say it, but there it is in Discord.
I was thinking it wouldn't be too hard to guess because who would have the servers?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
That's one reason to join our
man.
Discord. Yeah, I don't want to out them on air, but yeah.
Well, we don't have proof of that. That's
No,
somebody's
it's
speculation.
pure speculation. But that's, we're on a podcast, so we can speculate.
That's fan fiction, if nothing
That's
else,
right.
right? We can assume.
I want to speculate on plans to beam solar energy down from space with satellites, lasers, and microwaves.
Yeah. I
They've
thought
been
this was
talking
awesome.
about that since the 40s, actually.
Yeah, and they're
50s,
still
sorry.
they're not doing it yet. They're still planning to see if it's feasible. But I thought it was ridiculous. I thought this is stupid. I mean, it costs so much to put something in space. How could it possibly be cost effective? But they're claiming they'll be able to do it sometime in the 2030s, and they'll be able to beam things from satellites with microwaves to the ground at a cost of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And I checked, and right now, power in America costs 30 cents per kilowatt hour in California. So if they can meet that price, then it really is practical.
And this is basically getting a satellite that's closer to the sun to harness the sun's energy and over microwaves send it down to Earth? No.
It's not closer
it's
to the
in
sun.
orbit.
But what it is it's not closer to the sun, but actually what it is it doesn't ever have an atmosphere in the way.
Yep.
And you can even put it in a special orbit. So it orbits in a way that the dish always points at the sun without having to expend any fuel to do that.
Oh, because it itself is powered by solar.
Right.
But it can only send it back because unless you put receivers strategically across the Earth, right?
Right, but that's what you have to do. You're going to send a microwave beam down to the Earth, and you're going to have a receiver on the Earth. And that's why you can't use geostationary satellites easily, because the microwave beam is spread out, and you need a receiver a mile across.
Mm-hmm.
But you settle for lower orbit satellites. And maybe one thing that's proposed is a cluster of like 6 of them in elliptical orbit, so they come close.
I gotcha.
And then you switch from one to the other as they move across the sky, just like you do with satellite TV.
So I was worried about efficiency with this, but with that kind of a setup, you could probably be relatively inefficient and still kick some ass.
Well, they're trying to decide all this, but it's part of the green initiative in Europe. I mean, they're trying to get zero carbon emissions by 2050, and this would be a way to generate more solar power.
Yeah, it would be. And I can just imagine the people that don't like living under a power lines going to town here, but they're not everywhere.
Well, I wonder about the hazard of those microwave beams. A strong microwave beam is risky, and how are you going to stop airplanes and drones and everything from going through it?
Well, theoretically, if you were targeting areas that weren't populated and off of flight paths, you just run transmission lines to where you need the power.
That's
Maybe.
right. But you have to somehow stop people from flying through that airspace.
Yep. Then again, how are we keeping people off of railroad tracks?
I don't hear about being a problem much anymore.
Self-solving problem. Okay.
Oh, I wanted to get your collective take on this one. So, KeyPass is disputing that this particular thing is a vulnerability. So this is a vulnerability or not. Yeah. So let me describe it. It's a new vulnerability, CVE 2023-24055, and it enables threat actors with write access to a target system to alter the KeyPass XML configuration file and inject a malicious trigger that will then export the database, including all usernames and passwords, in clear text. And next time the target launches KeyPass and enters the master password, opens up the database, decrypts it, export rule is triggered, contents of the database is saved for a file for the attackers to retrieve. KeyPass is saying this is not so it's got a CVE, like the whole thing. Workarounds were in suggestions that when this rule triggers, it prompts you to either allow or deny this rule from triggering, or at least give you an alert that this rule is triggering. KeyPass said it's not a vulnerability because the attacker already has access to the system, which means they could compromise the password database in a number of different ways. This is like the Microsoft excuse. Like, well, they have local, administrator privileges, so all bets are off anyway.
And they are. I mean, I learned that from this podcast a while ago. You talked about a guy showing that these password managers have all your passwords just sitting in RAM. And I added that to my forensics course. They all do. So anybody that has administrative rights on your machine has got everything anyway.
Well, it's Hal's point. Like root is root. And there's little you can do about it.
Well, I thought you could design one better than that, but I haven't found any that is designed better than that. So realistically, none of them can handle this kind of attack, and they just accept that in the design.
I got the impression that KeePass is saying, look, in order to create this exploit, you've already got to own the system. So,
right.
But this is still a data exfiltration problem. I mean, yeah, you own the system, but you might be getting data about stuff that's not on that system this way.
Well, no, it's only exporting the passwords from that system. So, I mean, you could just as well.
No, it's from your. It's from your. It's from my KeePass store, not a system one, right? Or is it?
Yeah, from your
where
KeePass.
I could have stored a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, your KeePass store.
Yeah, it's your vault where you could have put all kinds of stuff. Yeah, like your credit card.
Right. I realize, but so basically, you need admin to do it, but then you're getting whatever credentials I stored there, which could then allow you for some,
Correct.
a potential target increase, which would be desirable. But still, credential capture by any other name, right?
Desirable is a matter of perspective.
True.
Desirable for the attacker, not desirable if it's all of your passwords that you had stored in that database.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm somewhere in the middle in this. Like, I think there should be. I like the notion that the user has more control if these rules are put in place, right? Like, you could say, okay, it's not a vulnerability. We don't want to say it's not a vulnerability because someone could have root, in which case there wouldn't be any vulnerabilities, right? So we need to land somewhere in the middle. I think there needs to be a mitigating control. Leave it to the user.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, it's outside the threat model. And if you have root, there's 100 ways in, and they can't patch them all. So, I mean, it's like you're using the product outside its design specifications.
Right.
Right. But at the same time, the idea of having a confirmation prompt before exporting all your data is not that wild.
No, you could do that, I guess. But it would just be a public relations move. It wouldn't actually make people safer.
That's the thing. It's a false sense of security. It's like, oh, well, my KeePass warns me if my password is being exported. But there's other ways to export those passwords that aren't going to give you a warning. So you don't want to give them a warm fuzzy. Just come with a big warning.
It's just a speed bump because half the people are going to click yes anyway.
Well, also there's a way to apply more controls too. So there's a way to. I don't know if it warns you. There was something in the article that I linked to that. In the Bleeping Computer article, that was some kind of additional control. However, the version of the app does the export. You could secure your database by logging in a system admin and creating an enforced configuration file, but there are caveats to that.
Oh.
Takes precedence over settings described in global and local configuration files, including new triggers added by malicious actors, thus mitigating the issue. But an enforced configuration file only applies to the KeePass program in the same directory. If a user runs another copy of KeePass without an enforced configuration file, this copy doesn't know the enforced configuration file is stored elsewhere, and no settings are enforced. So again, it goes back to Sam's point. There's like a workaround for the attacker to get around this.
Yeah.
If they have control of the system. So. Let's talk about universal plug and play. Oh my God. I feel like we never stop talking about universal plug and play. So there's a global memory corruption vulnerability in universal plug and play. You send the process can be exploited in the WAN or the LAN. Now, typically, UPnP is not exposed to the WAN by default. Usually exposed to the LAN by default, depending on what type of firewall that you have. A lot of the commodity stuff, like from Netgear, will just run universal plug and play automatically, and you got to go turn it off. When you do like pfSense, I think when I did pfSense, I looked, it's not enabled by default. So that depends on your firewall configuration. And I always make sure I turn it off. Because universal plug and play is that thing, like without authentication, something can modify your firewall rules. Like, why bother having a firewall at that point? But they said the UPnPD binary is not ASLR compiled, and the executable addresses are documented, and all other mapped modules run with ASLR. I don't know what they meant by mapped modules. Is that like other objects associated with UPnP?
Yeah, things in the memory map, I would assume.
Oh, okay. The memory map. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
But the actual running daemon is not protected. So you had...
Yeah, which is pretty strange.
Okay, so I'm not alone in thinking that's strange. That like you had
That's
ASLR
really
on this thing, and you didn't protect something as insecure as universal plug and play, which is horrific security, by the way.
Well, yeah, but it sort of suggests that they haven't updated it in 10 years. I mean, they don't even support PIE.
Yeah. So they also say they could replace sprintf with snprintf to control the sizes.
Well, of course. I mean, there's the 10 dangerous functions that everyone was supposed to stop using 20 years ago.
Not use the vulnerable functions, or apply compiler options that prevent against this as well. So, like, why wouldn't you just do that? I mean, I get it. Programmers make mistakes. But, like, compile time options, that's kind of great, because then that wouldn't... Does that compile time option enforce it automatically or kick it back out and won't compile if you've done something insecure? Or it probably depends on which compile option you got, right?
Yeah,
I think it fails to compile if you do it. But
if you have certain
Paul,
code
that's complicated and requires work. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, they'll probably be motivated to do it now.
Or we say that, but until next week, we cover basically the same thing on some kind of IoT device. It happens all the time.
Well, yeah.
We've talked about even specifically like Netgear, not to pick on them, but it's D-Link to with all of these device manufacturers. It's the same pattern of behavior on these devices, unfortunately.
Yep.
So like clearly they haven't learned, and I don't think this is going to be their example where they actually learn and go, oh, we can mitigate all like a lot of the stuff moving forward with good coding practices and compile time options. But they
well, this is why we need security labels on the box so the customers can buy the more secure one, and that would give them financial pressure.
Yeah, I can see the consumer like there's a checkbox like, did they use these compile time options that prevent against buffer overflows and address space layout randomization? And if they did, they get green checkboxes against them, right? That's always been my issue with labels is.
Yeah, well, your label should have like the OWASP top 10 or something. And it doesn't seem impossible to have a standard auditing like for compliance, and you do that, you get the mark. Just like Microsoft has a label they'll give you if their driver matches their quality test. And then you can charge an extra few bucks for your keyboard.
Yeah, but what's in that quality test?
Well, this kind of thing, I think.
No, they did improve some of it. They have improved some of it. They do. As far as I can tell, I have the recent Secure Boot stuff we covered several months ago. I did see a document from Microsoft that's like, hey, we're going to start checking for this particular security feature before your driver is signed.
Yeah, and Apple does. In the App Store, they require certain things. I mean, it's just like any other security audit. There's a list of things, and this certainly should be on there. Do your modules use ASLR? If not, you're not getting the mark.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's similar to an S, but Josh dropped, though, so we can't talk about S-bombs now. I'm just kidding. We can talk about them. Or not. Moving on. On a similar vein, did you read Rob Graham's article about how C can be memory safe? No, you should read it right now. No, it's good.
Well, in principle, C can be safe. It's just you have to be an expert coder. And in practice, there are common mistakes people keep making over and over, which is why a bunch of us would rather move to Rust.
Right. And that was his argument was it's easier, and I don't know if I necessarily agree, like it's easier to refactor C code than to rewrite it in something memory safe. there's a lot of variables in there, right? The skill of your developers, as you pointed out already, Sam, is one of them. However, refactoring is could be equally as hard, depending on how complex your code is in all of that stuff too. And not to mention, like, even if you refactor it in the way that he was saying, I still think developers are going to find ways around it and still introduce bugs.
Yeah, I mean, I think she makes a lot of weird decisions that are just hard to deal with. Like the thing they call a string is not really a series of characters.
No.
And that introduces just an endless chain of problems. And modern languages, a string is actually a list of Unicode characters, which is a whole lot better.
In C, it's a pointer to memory that contains parts.
Well, the point
of
of C is
string.
to be fast. I mean, C is almost assembly language. You're directly controlling the hardware, and therefore concepts like an array and a string are not really what you think an array and a string should be.
Right.
So, I mean, there's no reason to keep using it, I think. Rust is proving to be a good competitor, and there are others. I think these languages have just reached their expiration date, you know.
What Rob was suggesting was in the compiler to provide, well, like macros, essentially, that would enforce memory bounds checking.
Yeah, and there's already Microsoft has given libraries that remove the most dangerous functions. You can try to patch up C, but I'm not sure why you would. Why are you patching up an old language instead of just switching to a modern language that has rethought these things in a more modern way?
I think Rob's point is you got to rewrite all the code, and that's harder than trying to refactor what you have.
Well, that's an option, I suppose. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of
Well, it's going to depend.
I kind of run into similar things with COBOL. Huh?
I don't think they have memory corruption in COBOL, but I'm sure there are flaws.
No, I'm just saying about the idea of having to rewrite everything that was already in C.
Well, yeah.
Plan of attack on being able to orchestrate that would be problematic.
Well, there has to be a, you know, this isn't a low level decision. I mean, this has to be a fairly significant level of support. Like I remember back when my dad was programming, and those were the days when we wrote our own payroll programs. They had the whole thing working in RPG2, and the MIS manager decided we're converting everything to IDMSR and COBOL, and they did it. But they had management support for that to take the resources they need. So if you're going to convert from C, C++ to Rust, you're going to need support. Otherwise, you're going to get shut down before you're done.
A lot of variables. A lot of variables
yes.
to go into that decision.
Putting ching.
But I also think that it's not always necessary or the right decision. I think there are times where it's the right decision to go, we need to rewrite that legacy app, right? And it's more than just security. I think we can all agree that should factor into a rewrite of software. There has to be business justifications. There has to be performance justifications, both performance of your team and performance of the application. There has to be the future roadmap and demand from our customers. It dictates that we need to change the architecture or the language and rewrite it. And it's not to be taken lightly. I think people today, and probably one of the reasons why Rob wrote this article, is people are like, oh, well, if it's insecure and it's written in C, like just rewrite it in Rust. It's like, well, that's not.
Well, I mean, that might be a goal, but it might take you 10 years to get there.
Mm-hmm. Or never. I mean, there's also projects that just are not going to get the resources we need to rewrite them.
Yeah.
You know, or have the desire. I mean,
then they're not going to get that security label.
Yeah. And do people care? I wonder how much Python 2 code is still floating out there.
A lot.
Well, because that's not a rewrite, that's a refactor.
Yep.
And your refactor it depends on your application. Actually, when I did like 10,000 lines of Python from 2 to 3, and it wasn't horrible. But also, I probably coded for 6 or 8 months with it in mind that I was going to have to do that, and fixed a couple of things like here and there as I went. So when it came time to actually take the plunge, it wasn't as bad.
It can be
and
pretty
at this
bad.
point, how much new stuff is written in C and C? Like,
Oh, I think everything is still written in C and C Sharp and C++.
Yeah, but how many new projects are going, we're going to write this in C? Or are they going with Go? See a lot of Go.
Yeah.
I mean,
but if they are currently writing new projects in C, then wouldn't it be helpful to go ahead and do this soft fork thing? Is that part of what he's postulating? Is that
yeah. Some things are always going to be written in C, and if you're going to do it securely, make these changes. So what he's proposed that there will be needed changes in the compiler to enforce these memory restrictions. And if we do those, we could potentially write some more secure applications in C. But the flip side of that's still up to the developer. If you go back to Gary McGraw's interview that we aired not that long ago, we reran that one from the archives. And one of the reasons I picked that one is because a lot of the stuff he said was still relevant today. And one of the things he said in that interview, right, was if you take away the insecure C functions from a development group, software developers, they will rewrite them on their own. They will literally code a function so that sprintf works the way it traditionally did work. And that's just human nature. But that's what happens. This one was great. Discrepancies discovered in vulnerability severity ratings. I love this. I mean, I worked in vulnerability management for some time at Tenable, and I lived this. Like a CVE and CVSS scores, I should say, are a big thing. And people, much like SBOMs, it's all in how you treat them and handle them and the processes and procedures that you build around them. It can be done beautifully and work great, or not so much. And one of the things with CVSS that's interesting is that you can calculate your own score. So conceivably, you could have 3 different scores. You could have the one calculated by NIST, one calculated by the manufacturer or software vendor that created the software, and one that you calculate for yourself in your own environment. I think it's V3 that gives you those environmental flags that you can plug into the equations. V3, right?
Yes.
That does that. And you can all come up with different scores. And what does that mean? What do? You take the average of them? I mean, it's...
Well, if you're calculating your own CVSS score, that's the score you're supposed to use because that's
your environment.
Specific to your environment. It's tuned to your risks and your profile, so that's what be binding. I was just trying to figure out how the vendor and NIST were coming up with different. I mean, it's totally possible because they're subjective, but still, I'm like, how could they be that far apart?
Well, so Vuln check analyzed 120,000 CVEs and shows that almost 25,000 or 20% had 2 severity scores. One was from NIST and the other from the vendor of the product with the bug. In many cases, these 2 scores differed, making it hard for security teams to know who to trust. Now, it's not going to be any surprise when I tell you that turns out vendors either assign a lower score or don't even classify it as a vulnerability. So Microsoft assigned a vulnerability of 7.5. NIST gave it a 9.1. And then they say NIST assigned 12,969 of the 120,000 CVEs as a cross-site scripting vulnerability, while secondary sources listed a much smaller number, 2,091. So like 10,000 were not even classified as being a vulnerability. And also for CSRF, which means like a lot of vendors, and I've seen this, a lot of vendors don't consider cross-site scripting as a flaw.
Right.
Which in some cases they may have a point, that it's so hard to exploit, or successful exploitation doesn't really give you anything. I think it's still a vulnerability, but maybe you should have like a CVSS of 1 or whatever. Like, we're still recognize it as a vulnerability. These were just kind of taken off.
Well, yeah, because I mean, you've got the ease of exploit, and then there's the consequence of exploit, which are 2 different things. something maybe incredibly difficult to exploit, but could, bring the whole castle down, that should have a higher score.
Or you chain them together.
Yeah.
So by itself,
For
it's
context.
a CVSS of 1 because it's limited in some capacity. But there's another CVSS of 5 and another one of an 8. But the 8 is local, it's not remote. But all those chained together can unlock the keys to the kingdom.
Well, that's why I think a CVSS number doesn't really mean all that much. It's the real risk in your environment depends on the details.
Mm-mm.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people want to pretend, well, we'll fix the 10s and ignore the 5s, and that'll be okay. And you simply can't trust it that much. This reminds me of people that talk about meritocracy, and they believe that people that got an A are really better than people that got a C. And as an instructor, I know it's not that simple at all.
Right. Well, and people use CVSS as the same thing. Sam, they say, well, I'm only going to fix stuff if it's 7.5 or greater.
Right. And this,
again,
this is just a very rough approximation. You could very well be wasting your time on ones that don't matter and missing ones that really matter.
Right.
You really have to analyze it in your situation.
Mm.
I think this is an interesting point that it says often they tend to give preference to the CVSS from the vendor rather than from another source like NIST, which in one way is speaking well of that they're trusting the vendor to be completely accurate, but the vendor is not assigning the same severity level as NIST or somebody else would.
And it's lower.
Mm-hmm.
And since you've got so many vulnerabilities to deal with, if the vendor gives you a lower score and you've set a threshold of 7.5, and traditionally the vendor score is below that, I'm just going with the vendor score so I don't have to fix it.
Right.
Or, I mean, maybe it's not that I don't want to fix it, but maybe it's I've got 10,000 vulnerabilities in this report. And if I use the vendor score, like it's prioritizing those 3,000, like I don't have to worry about them right now. That still leaves me with like thousands that I had that I do have to, according to the way you counting them, I have to address.
Which in some ways I think speaks really well for the vendors that their clients are trusting them like that. Mm. But then if they're causing the problem because they're underreporting, just like when police departments underreport the crime in an area so that the
it's all a number. Yeah, you're right, Manny. It's all a numbers game when you start talking about CVSS, right?
Well, one of my corporate clients, they scan their code and they patch every vuln. They ignore the score completely. They say, make it so it will scan clean. Yeah. So they don't trust these numbers, and I think they have a pretty good argument for that.
Mm.
Yeah. On the other end, you could also keep an eye to the NIST known exploited vulnerabilities to make sure you're not missing something that's being actively exploited.
Yeah, certainly that's a good high level prioritization, but I like your client, Sam. That's kind of how I roll. I mean, and that's I think it's easier to do on a smaller scale. It's harder to do when you've got a large financial with thousands of applications to say you're going to upgrade every piece of software, every component to the latest version, and you're going to fix every vulnerability that's reported. Because then, the amount of time that you'll spend not, writing actual features and fixing actual bugs is much less. So that's a balancing act. But I do like, if you broke it up into smaller chunks, going, let's strive towards getting everything updated and addressing all vulnerabilities. I think that's a really good, it's how I like to roll. But again, I do it on a much smaller scale.
Well, companies just have different levels of security maturity. So at first you don't do anything, then you do the most dangerous stuff, and then you gradually evolve towards better patterns.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about the chaining vulnerabilities together thing, though. Did you read the exploit for the Lexmark printers? It's awesome. So, but last week we talked about how there was a remotely exploitable vulnerability in Lexmark printers. I was like, I really want to look at the exploit and see exactly what they're doing. And I start reading through the exploit code. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot of XML SOAP requests. I have no idea what's in all those huge blobs. But in that, my story number 17, in the exploit GitHub repository, there was a write-up where the author explains exactly how the exploit works. And it turns out, if you scroll down to the exploit section, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different steps. And there's very much chaining vulnerabilities, right? There's arbitrary file upload that has to exploit another service to do the CSRF to send. The CSRF actually allows it to send data to another internal service that is not exposed, that has the arbitrary code execution that writes an executable, like a shell script that basically does a callback.
Yeah, madness.
It was awesome. It's good
You
stuff.
can't describe a thing like this with one CVSS number.
No.
No.
And
Yeah, that's
you
why.
know, patch your printers, I guess. I mean, we've said that from day one, but no one listens.
But this is why you might want to patch all the vulns, because 6.2s might be a 10.
Yes.
Well, it's a great point. Just fixing one of these vulnerabilities breaks the exploit chain.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good read, and all the code is there.
Yeah.
Right.
Please don't use it without permission. I think at last count there was something like 5,000 or 9,000 exposed to the internet on Shodan. Maybe it wasn't that much. It was some relatively small number if you look at the total number of systems on the internet that were exposed on the initial port, 65002 TCP. Also, I think it's bad when your bootloader can reach out to a server anywhere over HTTP and pull down arbitrary files.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of weird.
What? What the hell?
But
You
U-boot
should
is
be allowing that.
but U-boot is for like smaller embedded systems. They kind of tout it as the bootloader that you use if you're just trying to get a board up and running. It ends up in production. I've seen it on IoT devices in the past. So they were kind of proud of this feature that was like, you can get to a bootloader prompt and you can pull down a file. And I think that file, correct me if I'm wrong, internet, that file can be like the thing you want to load, like a kernel or whatever. It can be like the next stage in the boot process, which is kind of interesting. UEFI has this capability where it can pull down a bootloader over SSL. They can do it over HTTP, but it also has capability to do it over SSL, which is why we had those open SSL vulnerabilities. We're wondering, is UEFI affected, but it wasn't the full functionality. It was only a portion of the functionality they implemented in UEFI. But you can totally, like Pixie Boot, but it's not Pixie Boot. It's reach out to the server over SSL, if you enabled that, and pull down your bootloader and your image, or that can be like one massive image, and basically load a kernel and operating system and pull it down over SSL. I thought that's pretty neat functionality. It's not used very often from what I'm told. So this U-boot feature was basically pull down files like wget style, but the module that was responsible for pulling down the files had a buffer overflow. And the buffer overflow gave you access to like certain registers and things like that where you could actually do something with it. So Nicholas Stark wrote this up. It's my story number 14. It's a good read. But I don't think U-boot has deployed this particular functionality like widespread. It was kind of a new feature. So the disclosure was weird. Apparently there's no like security contact at U-boot. So that's why he wrote the blog post. So hopefully they fix it and it doesn't get rolled out in widespread. But kind of an interesting one to, if you're into exploitation, take a look at that. You know, some of my friends looked at it and was like, wow, that's pretty heinous, actually.
You know, I just want to mention my story number 10. There's a new cryptography term we all have to learn, ASCON. And I don't know why. The NIST has approved a new cryptography family just for IoT, for small devices with weak processors like keyless entry fobs for vehicles. And they have a whole bunch of cryptographic and hashing algorithms all in the family of ASCON. So I don't know why It seems to me like you can do AES in pretty small code, but anyway,
Yeah.
Are they
you
gonna
should get.
they have a
I don't know
conference?
why
Are
there's.
they gonna have a
I don't know why
conference?
there's a need for this.
They have a conference
ahead.
about it and call it AskCon.
It stands for something, I suppose. Looks like an acronym, ASCO. I know, but this is a new word we got to learn, and I'm going to have to research and find out why this exists. I didn't know that the existing ones were not small enough and fast enough, but apparently not. It reminds me of IOTA, which was the cryptocurrency to run on IoT devices, which I also thought was a good idea. It turned out they did it all wrong, but this is Nish, so I imagine it's not obviously wrong.
And it looks like this has got, here we go. We have to learn it because it's got some quantum key resistance stuff in it. So therefore it's new and cool.
Yeah. And also smaller and faster, apparently. So if it really is smaller and faster, then it would probably have a lot of good applications.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I know you can get firmware. I mean, you can get hardware that implements AES. I mean,
I know. I thought AES was already small enough, but this has all the other variants, a set of hash functions and authenticated ciphers and everything. So, and if you're a keyless entry fob for a vehicle, you really don't have much room there.
No.
So we'll probably be hearing a lot more about that.
This could be actually pretty cool if it gets adopted.
Yeah. Well, I think anything smaller
Looks like
will get
it's
adopted by IoT.
for the workshop.
What's that mean?
Say that again,
It
Mandy.
looks like
You
the
broke up.
workshop is in June. The workshop with NIST on it is in June.
That could be
Says
very
it
interesting.
has been selected as a new standard for lightweight cryptography in the NIST Lightweight Cryptography Competition and the primary choice for lightweight authenticated encryption in the final portfolio of the Caesar competition. Interesting. So it sounds like it's gotten some traction, to your point, Sam.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And on the AI front, I was very interested in Duolingo's article explaining what they work, because this is what I do for a living, right? I take complicated technical problems and I try to make challenges for the students that will keep them engaged. So you have to make the challenges easy enough that they can do it, but hard enough that they're challenged. And Duolingo has made this scientific with AI, where they have a thing they call bird brain that measures how accurately the student is answering the question. And so it estimates their level of skill, and it keeps track of how difficult the problems are from other people's answers. And then it uses real psychological and learning research to determine what pattern of difficulty should you present people to keep them engaged. So it stays fun and they keep learning. Because I remember there's a lot of things like this. Like if you want someone to really repeat a behavior frequently, you do not reward them every time. Humans, you reward them every sixth time. And that will create the most stable repetition of the behavior you want. So it is anyway, I thought this is pretty awesome. AI may really contribute a lot to education by automating these things.
Well, that's always been the trick to creating a game, or we talked to Ed Scotus about this, is what's the right level of challenge that keeps people engaged, that isn't too easy, but isn't so difficult that people just give up.
And everybody knows the right answer is a personal tutor adapting it to the one student, where you carefully adjust the difficulty for that student. And this is what I spend a lot of my time doing. But if you can have an AI doing it, it would be much cheaper. The app adjusts it to you.
Yeah. Remember, was it Mist? What was the game back in the day? It was just like ridiculously hard challenges. Was it Myth or Mist?
There's a bunch of.
Yeah, that was the one that I played when I was in college. And Mist. It was Mist. Thank you, Sam and Goose. And it was just like, they present you with this virtual world basically, and you just there was no instruction. You just kind of had to figure it out, right? It was like that's the cover that's coming up in our Slack channel, and very little. There was no instruction, no nothing. You just had to figure it out. So when I got to designing a game, and I forget what kind of software it was that we were using, and for my class project, I designed a game. It was kind of similar to Myst. We could walk down the path, and there was no instruction. You just had to figure it out. And I got a lousy grade from my teacher because he was like, "I can't figure it out. It's too hard." And that's back to your point, Sam, of developing games and challenges in the right context.
Yeah. See, I played a game like that. It was called Windows 8.
Yeah.
And I went to a developers conference.
Did you
and
notice that the last name of the founder?
What's that?
Sorry. Did you notice the last name of one of the founders of Duolingo?
No.
Well, his name is Severin Hacker.
Oh, good. Well, that's
Fitting.
a good sign.
It's fitting.
Yeah. He's Swiss.
But, I went to a conference, and they had a whole track on user interface design, and I asked them what happened with Windows 8, and they said, it's a great user interface. The users are wrong who complain about it. And I said, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah. You're not Apple, basically.
Yeah. Well, your theory is right. It's the data that's wrong. As a scientist, I object to this way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. That was just kind of a note. We talked about that one. Cisco persistence. This one was really interesting. And this is on a series of routers I'm not too familiar with, but it had to do with the virtual provisioning or something like that. And essentially researchers were able to figure out how to install. It didn't seem necessarily firmware related to me. It seemed like they were able to install a software package that could persist through reboots. And their details on it were very, very light. They didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but when I heard persistence through software upgrades and reboots, I'm like, oh, you must have figured out how to put something on the ROM or modify the firmware. But they didn't specifically call that out. There was something above the quote that I put in my story that talked about the virtualization control. So allows administrators to deploy application containers or virtual machines directly on the Cisco device. And through that, there was a DHCP client ID option that allowed them to inject any OS command. So maybe it wasn't on the actual device, but the management software that you use to deploy these containers to your Cisco systems, you would just keep redeploying it. So it didn't matter if it was rebooted, new software was put on there, this container was put back and had arbitrary command injection. So I thought that was pretty neat. I haven't played around with that particular software on Cisco, but it's CVE 2023-20076. It was Trellix that posted it.
Yeah, I guess the fix is to factory wipe the device.
Or your management software. Because it seemed like it was on the management plane that you could provision apps to these systems. Application hosting component and allows administrators to deploy application containers. That's what it says. You all right, Lee?
Yeah. Just wrong. Salad went down the wrong pipe.
Never a good thing. Image Magic had a vulnerability. This wasn't a high risk kind of thing. It was a denial of service and arbitrary file read that's permissions dependent, but was an interesting read nonetheless. They identified Image Magic was used on Drupal-based websites. There's a combination for you of vulnerable software. Image Magic plus Drupal.
Yeah.
I mean, the arbitrary file read could be interesting. It's, kind of the theme of this segment, right? Vulnerabilities that build on each other. You could use that to then dig deeper into the system. If you can arbitrary, the way a lot of those CMSs work is there's usually a file somewhere, and in plain text is the database username and password. So an arbitrary file read on WordPress, conceivably Drupal, if I remember correctly, if you pointed to read that file, like in WordPress, it's wp-config.php, you read that file, all bets are off.
Well, hopefully you have permissions so it can't read that file.
I think it doesn't need to read that file to load, though, or can that file, I think it has to be readable. Does it need to be readable? Maybe not by the web server. Maybe you're right. The web server doesn't need read access to that file.
Well, I'm not sure, but I would hope not.
Yeah. I don't remember exactly. And I don't remember if there was workarounds. I know I put workarounds in containerized things where I built that file on the fly. So I could commit that file to Git, right, and store it in the build process. And it was like at build time, it would read an environment. Conceivably, it would read that from a secure password store, right, a vault. If you didn't have that use environment variable, load that in value from an environment variable on the fly when you built it.
Well,
go ahead.
I really like my story number 1 about Samsung Android. Android on the Pixel 7 is 15 gigabytes in size, which is fine, but Samsung has bloated it up with so much stuff they sold to other companies that it's 60 gigabytes.
That's why I don't use Samsung, dude. I mean, it's like the number one reason right there.
Yeah, and they said not only that, I didn't know this, but Android on the Pixel has 2 copies of the operating system, so it can put an update on one while you're using the other. And then it's just a few second process to reboot. So it has 2 copies of the operating system. But since Samsung is bloated up so much, they can't do that.
Right.
So updating can take a half hour of downtime.
But they do that on their that on their TVs too. So I got a Samsung frame TV, so it looks like a picture kind of thing. And the software that comes with it, you like pay a subscription to all the images. So they really lock you into their walled garden. But my wife wanted the TV to display pretty pictures, and I was too lazy to reverse engineer the firmware or find some kind of hack around that. I didn't even know if one existed. I'm like, what am I going to get myself into? This could be a long thing. Or I could pay $80 a year or $9.99 a month, and I could get access to all of their pictures, and I could just make it work. So after I hung the TV, I could be like, look, sweetie, there's pretty pictures on it. Isn't that awesome? So that's what I did. But then if you do that on this particular TV, you don't want to be switching to another display source to have a Raspberry Pi or a Shield or something that doesn't lock you into an ecosystem that's more open, which I like for my, I like Android TV for that reason. I don't like Roku and a lot of those other really closed systems because they lock you into stuff. They can collect telemetry on you. But I didn't want to have to switch sources, because you switch a source, then you get the pretty picture that will come up automatically. And it's got like motion sensing on it. So like it'll sense when you're in the room to turn it on and display the pretty picture. If it doesn't sense motion, it'll just go dark to save power. So I'm using Samsung software. So they've got an app store and you can install the app. But like you can't remove certain apps. I can't remove the YouTube app, because then my kids get on and they want to watch YouTube on the TV. And I'm like, no, this is like the pretty TV. You shouldn't be watching stupid YouTube videos on it. And I can't remove the app. So I'm like, now, like, what am I going to try and hack this thing? And then I got a lot of other hacking projects. I just want this one to work.
Yeah. And they say that the point of this is they sell the right to put stuff on the system partition to third-party companies so they can really harvest more data on you.
Yes.
Like Facebook and Netflix and stuff. So
I remove as much as I can. And then, like I said, certain apps I can't. And then you can set a password so that you can't open them without the passcode to that app. And that's like the best you can do, other than start reverse engineering and figuring out hacks. Maybe I should try and figure something out.
Or just put on like a custom ROM, right?
Yeah, exactly. You modify the firmware, but then that can get tricky. That can be an endeavor.
Well, then you're not going to have the right driver for that display unit. You're going to be sorry.
And then are you going to get if you start mucking with the firmware, is it going to break the subscription to all your pretty images on there?
Yep.
So, yeah, but that's why I went with that because that's the TV my wife wanted. Like, she wanted the Samsung with the thing on it, right? Like my other Samsung TVs, which explains why the TVs can get cheaper, because they're monetizing the apps that are on them.
So your picture frame is like your Windows laptop.
Yeah, pretty much. Because on my other TVs, I don't use any of the Samsung stuff, and if you don't plug it into the network and you don't enable Wi-Fi, it's just a device.
Right.
And then I plug in my NVIDIA. I like the NVIDIA Shield. I think it's pretty good Android TV, and that gives you like more access to all the Android features. And To my knowledge, I don't know about the NVIDIA like game stuff they put on there, but you can add and remove apps without restriction.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you a little more freedom. You can enable the debugger on that and do all kinds of stuff. It's just Android.
Fun.
Which is fun. So that's how you can put hacked apps on there that aren't in the store that they give you access to. So you can sideload an APK. If you were so inclined to load Cody or something on there. Not saying I do. Just saying. What was your story on Rust versus the Greek question mark?
Yeah, I know, not much to it. It's just a picture, but I thought it was awesome. Many coding languages, when you put in a bad character, they will just freak out and fail, and it's hard to find. And Rust, the compiler, will tell you this character right here is in fact a Greek question mark. It's not a semicolon. So it's just another reason to love Rust.
That's
I mean, it will not, because I've done that. I've had like an unprintable character in my bash code or JavaScript code, and then I've often just had to retype the whole page because I can't find it.
Yep.
And I hear there's a utility somewhere that will clean it up, but I can never find it when I need it. And you don't need to if you use Rust. Rust will just tell you, this is the bad character. It's right here. This is what it is. And, why doesn't everything else do that?
That's pretty nice. Yeah, we've all been in that situation.
Rust often wins competition. Yeah, there's often competitions where developers say they would rather use Rust for reasons like this. It doesn't stab you in the back all the time.
That's awesome. It sounds like CORS stabs you in the back a lot. I don't know if you read about cross-origin resource sharing. This article is really long, and it's really entertaining for a lot of reasons. I think when you get a framework or language, right? This is more of a framework, a mechanism that lets servers instruct browsers to relax for select clients some restrictions, including the same origin policy. And they go into excruciating detail. And they express people's statements on it. CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing, is hard. And then they list a bunch of tweets. One of them is very simple and to the point. Fuck CORS. Another one says, I've been building websites since 1998, and nothing has ever been as frustrating as dealing with CORS. Total clown town. I don't think I mentioned it today, but in case you didn't know, I hate CORS. It's always CORS, the bane of my web dev existence. And it goes on and on. And then I asked some of our fellow cohorts about CORS. And it was very similar to the Twitter statements. And I think anytime you get something that complex that is not looked upon favorably by developers, it spells security nightmare. Now, this was a new implementation. I didn't read the read time was like 40 minutes estimated for this article, but I think you should read down. Ultimately, they finally got to the part where there's a Go implementation of this. But it's typically bad news for security when developers hate something, because you know what that means. Once they get it working, don't touch it. And that's one of the kisses of death for security right there. So if you got, 40, 50 minutes to burn, you want to learn about CORS and why people hate it and potentially something to fix it, you can read my story number 5. Man, did you have stories you want to talk about?
I didn't get to import any. There was one I found really interesting that came to mind while you were talking about one of yours, and it was about the, who was it? It was a job analysis of all of the hacker for hire job postings, all the job classifieds on the dark web. And what they were offering and what percentage of them were now offering benefits or paid time off, and how it was really fascinating. I'll try to find that one again. I had a few stories this week, but I didn't get to.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is fake too. Like, did you hear there was a podcast that talked about hiring hitmen on the dark web and how most of them are just scams. Like, no one really dies, and you hire a hitman on the dark web and they take your money and then they report you to the police. And they just keep doing that. And it's like,
Okay, so I found my new job. I'm just going to start posting that.
right? I mean, at one part, you're like, you're a criminal because you're taking people's money because you're committing fraud. But you're also
Horrible.
not killing anyone, but reporting someone who conceivably has done something more horrible and ask someone else to kill someone. It's really interesting to delve into that whole. I mean, then they're all like legit people who will kill people online, or some people that fake it too. Like they'll fake do, or like there's the vandalism for hire, and so they'll just stage like the vandalism and not really do it kind of thing. So there's like a whole underground economy, but much of it is based on fraud and lies. But then again, there is the scary thing where people really actually do kill people as well.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I forget which
So much
podcast
for
that
honor
was.
among thieves, huh?
Yeah, I forget which podcast that was. It was a pretty good one. One of them on the whole. I don't know if it's a city or just one person that would basically out people that were trying to hire a hitman. I'll have to dig that up. It's worth a listen. Any other stories you wanted to cover?
Yeah.
Lee, did you have any other your stories you wanted to hit before we close out?
I was just looking at it. Actually, I thought there was one that was kind of interesting. Another one that I thought of you. Actually, two of them. One of them was this this most wanted hacker nabbed in France. It's my number 6.
That one, yeah.
What's
I think
interesting is
that and
25-year-old Finnish man nailed for at least 22,000 cyber crimes, if not more. And the thing about it is, you know, when he was a teenager, he was arrested, convicted, given a 2-year suspended sentence, a fine of about 6,500 euros, and now he's an adult, and he's still at it because they didn't throw the book at him. I'm thinking, boy, they're going to throw out the book at him this time, but it's like, damn, you know, and whatever it is, 6 or 7 years, he's at least maybe a little less prolific, but still at it. I'm just wondering what the consequences, and will he really take this guy off, or will he wind up in our lives again?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it's something that I lean on a lot of other podcasts for, is they interview and chronicle people that have been convicted of cyber crimes. It's really interesting to look at in history, like of all the ones I've read about and listened to podcasts on, is it tends to be kind of, I don't know if it's random, but some people just get the book thrown at them and they go to prison for a really long time. And then you hear about other people, like sounds like this person, they committed a lot of crimes and he's like just keeps getting off or serving a little time and getting out and then doing it all over again. It's really, the inconsistencies are really interesting in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, right now, all the press seems to be about, you know, international cooperations to take down Group X, whatever X happens to be, which I think is really cool that the international cooperation is working and they're able to take these guys down. I mean, that was, you know, it wasn't that long ago. That was nigh unto impossible. So I think that's a great move in the right direction. But yeah, then it comes to the court and they kind of give them a slap on the wrist. It's kind of ouch. Sort of kind of undermines the success there.
Well, in the internet, I don't pretend to understand the international laws too, because it depends on which country you're convicted in, all that stuff. And
Oh, yeah.
all the laws and the process is different in every country. So,
I guess, but on the other end of the scale, you know, the bar is moving, right? That's the good news. The bar is coming up on taking care of these guys and getting the right thing to happen, which is good.
yeah, it certainly has come a long way over time.
Yeah. Think about back with the cuckoo's egg, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a whole story. There's a book that we talked about. I can't think of it right now. I'd have to look it up. It talks about the other side. We talked about it on the show, the other side of the cuckoo's egg, and what happened to that various groups that kind of intersected. And one of the hackers, if you will, in that story, set himself on fire. It's like really bizarre circumstances how he died. And which is like, if you think about, not to be morbid, the way people kill themselves, setting yourself on fire is probably not high on the list for a lot of people. And so it was very mysterious, but they had ties and were working with Russian intelligence, and it kind of like struck a deal to break into U.S. Military systems. So like the whole story is bizarre. I'd almost listen to the story again. That's how engaging it was. And now I don't remember the book. Like I'd have to look it up. But
from the story, it sounds like he did a lot of low-level DDoS attacks, right? So even with this Lizard Squad that he was part of, and all that. So the thing is, doing one huge major cybercrime more devastating than doing 50,000 tiny basic cybercrimes.
I agree with, I think, where you're going. My thinking was, though, this is a kid who's heading down the wrong path doing a lot of stuff. And the system failed to pull him over to where he could use those skills for legitimate stuff. I know that's a little Pollyanna. I get it. But I don't know. I think well of people. I like to save them if I can. Hate me for that or not. But it's like, hey, come on. This guy's got some talents. He wasn't an idiot.
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of rehabilitation is an interesting thing. It ties in their background, a lot of other things. There's some pretty cool stories. Darknet Diaries did a lot of cool stuff, interviewing folks like that. Kind of gives you an insight into, their kind of thinking and various situations they're put in, how they deal with it, how they ended up.
So the last thing I wanted to mention is, you still using Jira, Paul?
In the cloud.
Yeah.
Not our own instance, yeah. Because like with Atlassian software, you can run your own on-premise instance.
Yep.
Or just use it in the cloud. So when we cover vulnerabilities, I always assume it's you're running your own instance of Jira or Confluence or whatever.
I mean, there's a bunch of there's some new vulnerabilities in the the self-hosted version of Jira, which are fixed or not an issue in the cloud version. And this is reminding me of Exchange. When it comes to Atlassian, use their cloud offerings. You're going to be in much better shape than having to take care of your stuff on-prem, because they seem to be Johnny on the spot on addressing whatever they find for their cloud offering.
It's super hard to produce a software product that you have a cloud instance and offer an on-prem instance. I'm learning more and more that is extremely difficult. And so, I mean, I get sometimes there's requirements to run it on-prem, but for most people, like you said, Lee, you just run in the cloud. You're probably at the end of the day going to be more secure. Security is going to be different when you run it in the cloud. It's more about identity and access management when it's in the cloud. And yes, you lose some of that control, but the providers typically can do a much better job hosting a cloud instance in a multi-tenant.
And they're going to get economy of scale when it comes to delivering you a consistent product that you can't afford.
Right.
And I did read the workaround on this one where you replace the service desk variable substitution plugin jar. And it says you got to put this in the right place and restart Jira. And I'm like, well, at that point, why don't I just freaking patch it instead of doing the workaround? You can do a workaround and avoid downtime, but if you got to do downtime for the workaround,
just
don't
patch it.
Right?
No, I agree. Yeah. There's that intersection of workaround and patch where, you should just patch.
And I've been the guy who's done this quick and dirty workaround, including a fast reboot that nobody will see, except guess what? People see it.
The one person that matters will see it.
Right. It's never somebody trivial that sees it.
No.
That dreaded knock on the door or phone call from that number you didn't want to see.
That service is down. No, it's back up right now. I needed to reboot it quick, and I think anyone's going to notice. Yep. Been there. Done that.
Yeah.
Have the T-shirt.
You know what? it's part of learning and development, and I think you got to make some of those mistakes to really appreciate them, and hopefully nobody dies in the process.
Right. Well, cool. Well, thank you
All right,
both.
but that's all I wanted to talk about tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for
Did you
listening.
go over the Lee? Did you go over number 8? I'm sorry, I was still interested in Paul's number 3.
Oh, this is really cool. Mandy wants to keep going.
3.
Sure. Let's keep going. Secrets pattern database. This is an entire database that someone put together of all these rules to look for passwords and secrets in various formats. So my whole thing was, if you've got a process, maybe you have some scripts, maybe you don't, that look for these secrets or passwords in an API or inside of files, you can easily adopt this database and write a script that takes this database and goes and tries this. So like the hard work, some of the hard work is already done for you in that it has this pattern database already built. You could easily build a tool, put it on top of that. At that, you could be a red team, or you could be developers and use this. You could be a red team that's using this as a fake adversary, or adversary with permission, or you could be a dev team that you're running this against your build infrastructure. Hal talked about securing your build infrastructure, and this is one way to do that, is to make sure that no secrets are where they shouldn't be. And this was like a complete database, was uploaded yesterday. It's got some scripts in here. I haven't looked at some of the scripts. It looks like there's some reference implementation, but I thought the database was pretty impressive and well done.
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
Finding those where they're hanging out is a never-ending challenge. And
well, it's that continuous security too, is not just doing like one check, like, oh, all right, there's no keys there, but doing that every day on a continuous basis, because keys tend to crop up. Developers make mistakes. We all want to push the easy button and go, I'll just throw the key in there now and I'll get rid of it later. And later, there's never a later.
No. And I'm thinking the more we can give tools to help find this stuff, maybe you don't automate it. Maybe you've got somebody who's not the developer, who's like 6 inches from the code and forgives every flaw, who can run it and say, hey, dude, you forgot this stuff, without, before you push it out there into your public repository and have all the bad things happen.
Right.
Mandy had mentioned my number 8 was that there was a Linux version of the Clop ransomware out there, that's got a faulty encryption algorithm, which, don't full stop after that headline, because this looks like what they did is they didn't just port the Windows version of Clop. They were rating a new one. They're adding features and augmenting it like all the time. So yeah, it may be an awful piece right now, but I suspect in a very short interval, it's going to be a full-featured version of Clop, and maybe even do more than what the Windows stuff does. So it is interesting. And this, like I said, it doesn't look like a port. It looks like a rewrite.
Which is the right way to do it. We talk about that with defensive tools. If you're just trying to port from Windows onto Linux, that you're missing out on so much, because the architecture of the operating systems are completely different. And yes, you could port it over, but rewriting and maintaining different versions, certainly of certain applications, like an anti-malware, endpoint solution, as we've touched on in the past, like what ones are really good for Linux. Well, certainly not the ones that kind of just took their Windows version, tried to port over, as much functionality as they can, and try and maintain it. It's the rewrite that harnesses all the capabilities and areas within Linux. And so the ransomware groups actually had a really good development strategy. And to your point, Lee, right, there's going to be some bumps in the road. Like, the encryption isn't quite right. Well, it's because they actually took the time to rewrite it. So you're right. They might get it right.
In Linux, we can get at some of those file system drives. We could probably do some really wicked things to systems if we sat there and messed around with the file system level drivers, which you can't do in Windows, and really wreak havoc. At least that'd be fun to play with.
I think that comes down to got to really lock down your Linux. You could have admins that know what they're doing to really lock it down. Short of having third-party tools that really do a good job of helping you. On that. Although, I mean, some of the, popular endpoint systems, you mentioned CrowdStrike earlier, I mean, they've got a Linux version, which tends to be pretty good. So
it is. So, but yeah, you're right. You got to lock it down. There's, we're not getting back to the static compiled kernel with no loadable drivers. That ship has sailed.
For sure.
I don't miss those days, actually.
There's always a use case for, I just need to load this driver quick and do a thing and then unload it kind of thing. I mean, Secure Boot helps mitigate that to a certain extent, but, that has issues too, as we've documented. So,
yeah. I still remember a server would show up and a disk set of drives, whether it was an array or not, would show up. And the person who orchestrated the purchase said, yeah, here's this server. It's running, it's running SunOS, Solaris, whatever. And here's the third-party driver that'll make my disk drives work, and we're going to boot off them. Yeah.
How's that work?
You get a kernel built-in supported drive.
Yeah.
Start compiling.
Yep. Yeah. So your external drive becomes the second stage.
Yeah.
You got to put your OS on something that's in the kernel.
And if you can compile it statically, you can get it to boot off that third-party driver because the loader's in the image on the disk.
Right.
But
until you need to update your kernel, then that proprietary driver doesn't work in the new kernel.
Those were the days when I was afraid of patching.
Yeah. Well, we all have those battle scars, Lee. That's why we have a little tick and when we talk about patching.
Then again, we learned a hell of a lot.
Yes.
And we did some cool shit that people said couldn't be done.
Mm-hmm. Now I find myself getting a little too far ahead of myself and running newer kernels and then stuff's not supported. Like that open snitch, because I'm kernel 5.10, doesn't have ePPF support, which is interesting. I was kernel 5.15. That was way too bleeding edge. Then I had display driver issues. And I was like, whoa. And that's what people say, like, oh, kernel 6 is going to be great. I'm like, yeah. But you're not getting there anytime soon. I mean, you might get there in certain circumstances, but there's a whole bunch of dependencies on your kernel version. To your point, like even back in the day, that's always the thing.
Yeah. So, all righty.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening and watching this edition of Bald Security Weekly. We'll see you next time. Over and out.
Good night.